Hi guys, so today we're going to be going over the Desmos activity you had on Friday, and a lot of you guys had the question about what does the word misconceptions mean? So misconceptions is like a mix-up or a misunderstanding. So we were looking for the misunderstandings that Homer had. So there was 3 of them like I hinted, and let's go ahead and read it together. It says, the sum of square roots of any 2 sides of an isosceles triangle is equal to the square root of the remaining side. And one of the misunderstanding was corrected by the man in the stall. It's supposed to be a right triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight where it says isosceles triangle. That should have been a right triangle. Another misconception that like you can barely see it because I think only a few noticed it and not many notice it. It says the sum of the square roots. So we don't say square root, we say squares. So I can see where you guys kind of missed it because square roots and squares sound very similar. But remember, square roots are these, and squares are exponents of power to the 2. Okay? And our last misconception is of any 2 sides. That's not true. Remember, it's of the 2 legs, okay? So this should have been legs. So let's go ahead and read what you guys wrote. So one of you guys said, the sum of the square roots of any 2 sides of a right triangle is equal to the square root of the hypotenuse side. So here you guys kind of caught one of the mistakes, right? That it's not any of the 2 sides. It's the 2 sides of the legs, and then it has to be the hypotenuse. But once again, you fell for the whole square roots. It should have been square. The sum of the squares of 2 legs of a right triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse side. Okay, so very small detail, so we could have also seen why the Simpson writers also got confused. And this one was actually really good. It says the form of the Pythagorean theorem is leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. So I like how this person caught on that it should have been squared, but they did miss out on the whole, it has to be a right triangle. Do you guys hear that alarm? I think my neighbor's house is burning. Hold on, let me go check. Apparently their meat was burning, so the alarm went on. So that's what was happening if you wanted an update. Okay, so a way we could have rewritten it is that I'm using this student's example is the sum of the squares of the legs of a right triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. So that's just one way of rewriting it. Just making sure that we understand that the Pythagorean theorem applies to right triangles and that the squares of the legs is what equals the hypotenuse square. Okay, just make sure you understand that. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to our new stuff today. We're going to be looking at error analysis problems, and all what that means is that you need to find the mistake that they made. Okay, so even tells you here in the first problem that Erica solved for the missing leg the following way and that it was done incorrectly. So what was Erica's mistake? What should she have done instead? Go ahead and pause the video, think to yourself, what could she have done instead? What was her mistake? Okay, so hopefully you noticed that this 10 right here is supposed to be the hypotenuse. So remember, our hypotenuse is across from our right angle. And we know that she immediately messed up on her first step. So that means that everything from down here is going to be wrong. Okay, so it should have been set up as 8 squared plus x squared equals 10 squared. Because remember, our equation is the same thing as leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Okay, 10 is our hypotenuse, so that's why I substituted 10 in for our hypotenuse. And now let's go ahead and solve, because this is what she should have done instead, right? So 8 times 8, 64 plus x squared equals 10 times 10, which is 100. Now I need to get my x squared all by itself. To do that, I'm going to subtract by 64. Subtract by 64 to the other side as well, because remember, what I do to one side, I have to do it to the other. If you feel the need to draw the line, go ahead and do so. 64 minus 64 is 0. I still have my x squared. 100 minus 64 is 36. Okay, and then there's still one more step. My x is still not by itself, it's being squared. The opposite of squaring is taking the square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I get that x equals 6. So my missing length should have been 6. All right. So what was her mistake? That the 10 should have been substituted into the hypotenuse and not for the leg. Okay, so let's look at problem number 2. Let me write down my formula. Leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. I'm going to go ahead and draw my arrow to identify my hypotenuse. I'm going to check that they substituted correctly. So the 10 is in the hypotenuse place, that's good, and the 5 is in the leg place. So it looks like we are good for the first step. 5 times 5 is 25, 10 times 10 is 100. Good. Second step. Okay, now here, it looks like they have b squared equals 75. How do you think they went from this step to this step right here? Yeah, they probably subtracted 25 to both sides. And this is 0. 100 minus 25 is 75. Okay, now let's look at this step right here. They have a fraction bar, which means to divide, and it looks like they're dividing by 2. Do I get rid of a square by dividing? No, I do not do that. So that's their mistake. So their mistake is they divided by 2 instead of taking the square root. So we can always say the inverse of squaring is taking the square root. Okay, so not much work for us to do here. If I were to write down the steps correctly, I could copy the first 2 steps because I know those are correct. And now here's where I have to be careful. So I think they did this part correct as well, actually. So they had b squared equals 75. Now this step is where they messed up. They should have taken the square root of both sides. The square root of 75 is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to leave it as the square root of 75. Okay, so this is the correct way of doing it, and this was their misconception. So the misconception was that to get rid of the square, they had to divide by 2, but we know that that's not the case. We know we had to take the square root. Okay, so now let's look at our last problem. And this is also a mistake I saw quite a bit on Edpuzzle. Go ahead and take a look. Where do you see the mistake? Hopefully you notice that it's right here. Let's go ahead and slow it down. Let's name our parts. Across here is my hypotenuse. That means these other spots are my legs. Sorry, these other sides are my legs. I know that my formula is leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. So by labeling our parts of our right triangle, we can tell that they did substitute correctly. So I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite this step. Did they do their second step correctly? 4 times 4 is 16. 6 times 6 is 36. I can replace hypotenuse with c squared if I want to use that for my variable. 16 plus 36, that does give me 52. Bring down my c squared. Do you see the mistake now? What happened? So instead of solving for c by taking the square root, they kind of just dropped that exponent of 2, which we cannot do, right? To undo squaring, we have to take the square root. So in reality, c does not equal 52. c equals the square root of 52. Okay, guys, so I hope that by analyzing these mistakes, we are able to avoid them later in the future, okay? Hope this helps and that you learned something new today.